Welcome to Explore, Explain. This is a long-form video and podcast series sharing conversations with data visualization designers and developers from around the world. Each episode explores the detailed hidden thinking behind a single project or a series of related works to explain the what, the why, and the how of the design process. There are some wonderful guests and some wonderful projects to learn about. So let's jump in to today's episode with your host, Andy Kirk.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Explore, Explain. And in today's episode, I'm delighted to welcome Ros Pearce from The Economist. Ros, super to meet you, super to chat with you today. For the benefit of the viewers and listeners, can you give yourself a brief introduction, please?
Hi, I'm Ros. I'm a visual data journalist for The Economist, and I design our graphic details section, which is like the only section of the paper dedicated to data journalism. So I work on both the print side of things and also I adapt things to the web and occasionally do an interactive, although not so much anymore.
And we're going to talk about one of the projects you worked on, I think it was in April of this year, which is about the topic of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it's a project titled Nearly Half of Mariupol Has Suffered Grave Damage. And there's some fascinating stuff that we're going to go through on this. But just for the benefit of especially the listeners, can you give people a brief sort of synopsis about what this is, what it's about, and kind of what it looks like, what form it takes, please?
Yes. So my very talented colleague Ainsley realised that we could estimate which buildings in Mariupol were damaged using data from a satellite. So there's this instrument called an SAR, which sort of pings microwaves at the surface. And essentially, if buildings are reduced to rubble or if they're sort of at a lower level, it emits a different signal. So the rubble reflects back more microwaves. So she compared images before and afterwards, and from that we were able to estimate which buildings were damaged. And then I designed that into a big map where we've got building level data. So every building that we estimate to have been damaged is coloured in red, and other ones are coloured in a neutral grey. And then accompanying that, I've also got some bar charts just giving a breakdown of the proportion that were damaged by type of building. So industrial were the most hit, but residential buildings had also a really large area damaged, partly just because they make up a large area of the city.
Right.
And then below that, we've got a time series as well, just sort of showing when this happened. And it basically happened fairly steadily since the beginning.
So from the point of view of how things arise internally at The Economist, how does a piece like this originate? Is it because, as you mentioned, your colleague Ainsley recognised the possibility of a methodology and then that kind of inspired the idea for this work? Or was it that the work, something about damage, something about the war's potential kind of economic costs especially, was something worth pursuing, and then that led to the discovery of the methodology? Where's the chicken, where's the egg in this case?
Well, I can't speak exactly to what my colleague Ainsley was thinking, but in general, we were trying to cover the war in Ukraine in the graphic detail section because we thought it had quite a lot of visual potential. Another colleague of mine also explored satellite data showing where bombings happened, but like for some reason or another there was some like methodological reasons that we weren't sure it was accurate. But Ainsley basically found the data for this, realized it was feasible, also because we had on the ground data from the UN for a portion of the city, which meant we were able to like sort of fact check our own like code, so it should be fairly accurate. So it was sort of data first and then story data.
And in terms of the scope of what The Economist covers, I mean, I think there's perhaps a lazy assumption that it's just about the economy stuff. But clearly, again, in the sort of description of the raison d'etre of The Economist, it's anything to do with current affairs, international business, politics, technology, and culture. So it's got a broader remit than perhaps most expect. But that said, of course, for any topic about war, there are infinite different topics you could zoom in on. But was there something about, kind of infrastructure, about building damage that is specifically kind of within the kind of remit of what you would typically focus on in this kind of story?
So yeah, I think we are, like, our name is slightly misleading, because I think in fact I definitely thought before I knew much about it that we mainly covered economics, but actually it's really broad. Like, we also do, you know, there's a science section, there's books and arts section. It's like really quite broad. It's just we're mainly interested in sort of geopolitics and global affairs. So yeah, it wouldn't necessarily have had to really be about like economics for it to interest us in this section. But yeah, we are, like, basically, as long as there's an interesting data story, then yeah, we've done really diverse topics in the section. So even stuff like about, like, for example, the Inca Trail in Peru, you know, music from Spotify. Yeah, so it's a real range.
And you mentioned there about your kind of colleagues and collaborators. Can you just give a bit more sort of detail about kind of who you worked with on this and perhaps the different roles that you occupied? Because I think one of the things about a lot of data viz work is that we often kind of work on these alone, but we are therefore expected to have lots of different hats and skills. When you've got access to colleagues and teams and different capabilities, it's a nice blend, but it creates a new problem. You know, how do you work well in a team? So who was involved and kind of what are the mechanics of how you do work together?
Yes, so in most stories for this section, there's a data journalist who is more involved in the sort of data analysis side of things. They do the data and the number crunching, and they also write the piece. And then they're paired with a visual journalist who does more of the visual side of things, although it is a slightly blurry boundary. So sometimes I do a bit of the data cleaning and all of that kind of stuff, and sometimes the data journalist will create like roughs of charts, but then I'll sort of go into a bit more detail and like try different things with it. So yeah, and also those two things do feed back into each other, so it's not like the data journalist just writes a story and then like I just like have to make a visual from that, and there's like no back and forth. Like, things I plot could affect how the story, you know, the line of the story. If like the main image is showing one particular thing, then they'll probably adjust the like what's sort of featured in the story to go with that. And yeah, and vice versa as well. If I know that we're going to be focusing on a certain angle, it looks a bit weird if that's not reflected in the visuals.
Right.
And this also is not just for the graphic, doesn't just go for the graphic details section. So for example, if we do any maps in other parts of the paper, we'll try to make sure that places that are mentioned in the piece are on the map, and so on and so forth.
So obviously you clearly dovetail as roles, data journalist, visual journalist, very well. I mean, I think traditionally, or maybe historically, it's been more of a sort of a supply chain where one of those people comes up with the idea and the other person translates it into a nice looking image, but there isn't that sort of back and forth and overlapping of duties. And I think, you know, the kind of healthier way clearly is how things operate, as you've expressed there. Just some of the practicalities around this topic, because one of the key things about this is, first of all, timing. So this was published in April. What kind of deadlines / duration of work constraints were you working to? Because ideally you'd have, you know, kind of weeks and weeks to sort of fine tune these things, but you've got other things to fulfill as well. So what's the kind of timescales you were having to work to in this case?
Yeah, it was actually quite a tight a tight schedule, just purely from like bad luck of when people's holidays fell, and also because we were working to a news peg, so we wanted to publish it before Mariupol fell. Basically, I mean, we could have published it afterwards, but it wouldn't have been quite so relevant, you know, if it had like fallen weeks before. So yeah, I had about 6, maybe 5 full working days to do this. Isn't actually that much. Also, considering that I had a bit of difficulty with the files being really large, which meant that like editing them was really, really slow. So that also kind of slowed things down quite a lot.
Yeah, it sounds like 2 of your full days were about just rendering and running routines. But you mentioned the term there, news peg. I'd never heard of that before until we spoke and emailed before this. Can you just elaborate on what that means?
Yeah, I sort of forget that that's a bit of journalese. So essentially, it means that for not for every story, but often we try to hang a story on a relevant peg. So
I see, right.
For example, when I did we did a map of the victims of Auschwitz. Peg was the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, or yeah, I mean, sometimes we do things without a peg, but often it helps if there's some kind of relevancy of why we're talking about this now. So yeah, that's called a news peg.
Interesting. It makes lots of sense. Of course, you want to time things around when things are current and relevant, and certainly not after the event.
And also this week, for example, with the heat wave in Europe, we just published one about heat stress, and we were going to do it the week afterwards, but then it got brought forward by a week because it was a bit like, well, we should just publish this now while everybody's thinking about heat waves.
Before it starts raining again in Britain, yeah, absolutely. Exactly. Another key factor for The Economist, and you mentioned already, is that the output of this work is for both print and for digital. And although there are sort of shared assets that go into both, and there are similarities, they offer different constraints and indeed different opportunities. And we'll speak more about some of the specific design freedoms and frictions that you faced around the kind of the limitation of space there. But are you, in terms of the kind of attitude that you have as a visual journalist, are you primarily serving the print and then the digital becomes the secondary output, or are they kind of both equal importance and they've both got to be as good as they can be in each case?
Yes, so when I first joined The Economist, I think there was a little bit more of a print first mindset, just because of history, but we are trying to move towards them both being equally important and giving more space to think about what needs to be changed for the web, because of that, obviously there are very different formats. So for example, for print, you're looking at the page all at once, which actually means you need to design it quite differently. You need to make sure that because you're not sort of seeing things in a flow of information, right. It needs to make sense if you're just absorbing it all at once. But then with web, you can have a bit more of a structured narrative because you're showing people stuff in a sequence. So yeah, our sort of web, and actually I think in the very early days of the Economist website, we just sort of bung charts in a JPEG, which obviously is not great because a sort of flat pixel-based image is just going to look quite blurry. So now we at minimum try to use AI to HTML for our sort of premium data viz, which essentially means that the text renders really crisply because it's actually HTML text sort of hovering over the image. And then also with AI to HTML, you can make responsive versions, so it looks it's legible on a mobile and other screen sizes essentially. Yeah, we've recently also expanded our interactive visual journalist team a lot. So we're also doing more ambitious things with not just necessarily making AI to HTML, something made in print. We're making sort of whole new things. And in the web version of this one, we did do a slider just showing sort of comparing the SAR satellite data with how the buildings actually looked. So yeah, the answer is we're trying to make sure that they're equal.
Yeah, and clearly, especially with what you just said about the context of timescales, there's a lot for you to almost instantly trade off and decide upon the richness of opportunities that exist versus what's pragmatic within the time you've got. And again, we'll speak later on about some of the things that you kind of experimented with and the extent to which you thought, well, I can't really kind of make that work, so we have to just abandon it. And I can imagine that in the wide variety of work that you've been involved in, there must be lots of pieces where you thought, I wish we could just have a bit more time. I wish we could do that again in the web. One of the things that I did notice about the web version, and it's probably been there for a long time, I've never really noticed it before, but is this feature, listen to this episode, which is a kind of an audio commentary or audio readout of at least the written content. I've not listened to the whole thing, so correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if it describes the photos as well, but is this a recent thing? Because it's clearly minded, I guess, for accessibility reasons, but it's a super nice kind of extension of the benefit of that printed output. Sorry, the digital output.
Yeah, so I believe all articles in the Economist website have this feature, which is obviously quite useful, although probably a bit less useful for like things in the graphic detail section. It's so visual focused, and while I might add some alt text to these images, which is basically a sort of very basic description of what it shows, you're not really gonna get the same understanding. So I sort of do think there's an argument for maybe like losing that on graphic details. It's just gonna be a very incomplete experience. But I don't know.
I guess it's just another way to make things accessible to people. But I mean, the point stands about something as rich and as visual as this one. Just a bit of alt text saying a map of damage doesn't quite do justice to the resolution that you've got the imagery for. But one of the other things that I was curious about was you talked about this news peg sort of driving the timescales. And I guess therefore the intention would have been, and maybe still is, for this to be a one-off piece of work. But maybe just again, kind of on reflection, could it be that this is now something that you would revisit either for Mariupol, which is the subject of this work, or any other region of Ukraine, or indeed any other region worldwide? I'm thinking the techniques that you've kind of established could be applicable to things like natural disasters and earthquakes and all sorts of things.
Yeah, well, I believe the methodology that my colleague used to detect the damage is actually like originally used for floods and earthquakes and things like that. I believe scientists use it to sort of detect those things anyway. So I think it would be quite possible to sort of like lift that code and try and use it for somewhere else. I mean, I don't know if like doing an update on Mariupol would necessarily be that interesting, because I think it fell to Russia not that long after. So presumably there hasn't been a load more damage since. It might not look that different, although I'm not actually 100% sure about that. But yeah, I do think it could be really interesting to do this for somewhere else, if another war zone or a natural disaster.
And I guess just thinking aloud, there could also be the reverse story when things get rebuilt. I guess it could be a way to sort of see that progress if and when that does happen. Just a few other quick kind of contextual factors. To what extent did you feel that you had to be just very aware of the sensitivities of the subject matter with any of the choices that you made, given that it's about war and it's about people's buildings and their home cities? Obviously, a lot of the photo imagery includes images of people and kind of close-up damage. But to what extent was that a thread always sort of running at the back of your mind, and especially with regards to even the language of how this event is being described, the Russian invasion of Ukraine? So I guess there's a broader The Economist house style approach, way to handle this, that you have to inherit and take that responsibility.
Yeah, so I do think that's a bit of an issue for data viz in general, just because it's a slightly sort of cold numbers based art anyway. So I do think there is a bit of a risk of being a bit insensitive by just reducing everything to numbers, which is partly why in the web version we thought it would be good to have some images from the city, just to add a bit more of a sort of like, I don't know,
human
like
texture.
Exactly. And I do think that you can get so sort of excited about the map and you're sort of like just thinking about the data viz that you can easily forget about it, or not even forget about it. It's almost like if you like continually think about how dreadful all the things you're mapping are, it can get a bit depressing. Almost like a coping mechanism, maybe.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I did actually previously spend like 5 years working for a climate change website, and I definitely found that while I was doing that, I sort of just narrowed in on the work I was doing without actually thinking about it too much, because if I thought about it all the time, it would just be really depressing.
Well, that's it.
But I also think, that said, like I do try to be careful, like in terms of the language used, and also in terms of the colors. So normally I would be a little bit wary of using reds for depicting war and like death and destruction. Because I think there's a bit of a risk of ending up with a sort of like, it looks too much like blood. It could be a bit of a like horrible metaphor. But I think in this case, so actually I tried to go with a blue color scheme for the map, because I thought it sort of set a more somber tone. But then I found that the blue actually wasn't bright enough. It didn't really stand out. And in the end, I decided that our Economist red was actually fine, because although it's a red, it's a more orangey red, so it doesn't look too much like blood, but it does give you a sense of sort of warning. Of like, look at this. It has that kind of like urgency. So
and it has that spot color, that accent color purpose. And I suppose, again, by extension, the question then expands to the design constraints that are existent in the Economist. And I mean, again, we'll speak about the colors in more detail later on, but do you have flexibility beyond the corporate color scheme, or is it pretty much right, we've got to use the Economist reds, maybe a bit of blue and other sort of variations of sort of grayscale? But is that usually the starting point? We've got to try and work within these constraints.
Yeah, so we do have a chart color guide, which we definitely use in other parts of the paper. We're a bit more, and also, by the way, that is actually quite a broad selection of colors. So there is quite a bit of flexibility in like what you can pick. It's like, because there's so many different purposes you need color for. Like, you know, there might be an occasion where, you know, a certain color choice could be confusing or even like offensive. So you need to have quite a big variety, I think. Like, for example, for a political party, you need to use a color that makes sense for that political party. And you might want to avoid like coloring like females in pink and males in, for example. Like, and also there are like different cultural meanings attached to color in different parts of the world, which like it's hard to always remember. But for the graphic detail section, we're a bit more flexible, just because it's sort of like our flagship like data viz thing. We and also because you're designing a set of charts that have to work like in concert on a whole page, often that actually means you have to like be a bit more flexible, because like sometimes our general chart colors that work together on one chart don't actually look very good when you design a whole page with like these 5 colors or whatever.
So it's interesting that, because I know that a lot of organizations have just got this blanket, our corporate guideline is the corporate guideline and everyone will follow suit.
Yeah,
but it's often necessary, as you said, for a visual team or a graphics team to have that extra flexibility because of the purposes that you've mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I think it varies quite a lot. I think there's some, so for example, like the UK Met Office like always uses that green. But then like other end of the scale, you've got the New York Times, who like, I don't think they have one, because their font is so sort of iconic that they almost don't need to, because like every chart in that font looks like a New York Times chart.
Yeah, that's it. And obviously one of the reasons why these things exist is for that recognition, that immediacy and that kind of consistency, which is a byproduct of those sort of guidelines. Now, we'll come on to some of the sort of technical tools that you use later on. But I'm interested in your process. To what extent do you do things before you get into the data and the visuals? To what extent do you do things like sketching or initial, I don't know, maybe initial research about how others have tackled a similar kind of product? Or do you pretty much just going to get straight into the data, straight into the tools and see what emerges through that sort of crafting method?
I think it kind of depends on the type of visualization. So for a map, often like sketching it isn't actually particularly helpful. It's better to just sort of have a play around in QGIS, because that will sort of almost do the sketching for you. Like, and the same with like certain visualizations. Often I find, so we use an R package called ggplot, which I find is very useful for just quickly trying different types of chart with the same data. Just sort of change a line and try a different chart. But I do sometimes do sketches when I find that the concept or like a bit confusing, and I just need to almost like work it out.
Right.
Like I sort of have an idea, and I want to just quickly communicate it to my colleague. But like if it's the kind of thing where it might take a while to just draw up a draft of it. So yeah, the answer is sometimes, but sometimes I think it's because we're working quite a short time frame, it's quicker to just sort of start.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's good to hear, because I think some people who do just pen and paper sketching forget that they can use tools in a sense to be a way to sketch. And others who just use tools forget that you can use pen and paper and just do rough ideas on paper to see if it's working, especially if you're working with colleagues and you need to sort of show the what's buzzing around your head. Here's what it looks like in my head. Are we on the same page with this? The other just quick question from the outset was it always going to be Mariupol? Was it always going to be a map that you were working towards here?
I think, I can't remember what the reasoning, I mean, I can't remember what the reasoning was for picking Mariupol, I guess just because it was like such an immediate thing that was happening, it was going to fall soon.
It was very much the topic that we were seeing on the news, I guess, so it's something that would be relatable. Yeah. And
I think also because the UN had like done we had that data from the UN, it meant we could verify it. I think there was talk of maybe like doing other, I think our editor might have suggested we could like expand it out, but then in the end I think we thought it was better to just focus on one page, because I don't even know how we could have shown other Ukrainian cities in the same page. It's sort of a constraint there, because there's already quite a lot in one page as it is. And then also, we wouldn't have had that sort of fact checking like we did with Mariupol. And was it going to be a map? I think just with anything that's with satellite data, often a map is just the best way of showing it.
And again, we'll get into this shortly, but the where matters in this piece. It is a spatial piece of analysis, not something that just happens to have geographical elements to it, for which other charts would be better treatments. But I think that it's clearly apparent.
That's a good point actually, because I sometimes feel like maps do get a bit overused. It's sort of people are like, oh, a map's really cool, let's just put this data on a map. When actually, if there's no geographic element to it, it's actually like clearer on a chart. But well,
it is, and also as we'll come on to, it's clearly a very intricate task with this, because you're looking at building level details. So I'm sure if you could have not done a map, it would have been a far quicker process. But now you've already mentioned that you didn't necessarily get your hands on and take the lead with all the data collection and analysis, but to the extent to which you can speak to this, can you just sort of talk us through the methodology? Because it's fascinating, this whole notion of classifying building damage. And I know there's a diagram that will show for people watching this on the video version of the sort of simplistic model of how this satellite thing works. Can you just speak to the extent you can, what's the process of how you kind of captured damaged buildings?
Okay, so this is going to be a very rough guide, because
sure, that's what we need.
did most of it. But as I understand it, so we use data from the European satellite Sentinel-1A, which has this instrument on board called an SAR, which sends microwaves out. If the building has been reduced to rubble, then more of these microwaves will be reflected back to the satellite, because I think they just sort of bounce away otherwise. And if the building has been flattened, then that results in like a change in the phase of the wave being returned to the satellite. So we're looking for changes in amplitude and changes in the phase. And we had a satellite image before the war that we could compare it to, and we basically compared these two images. And then because we also had data from OpenStreetMap of where the buildings were and their type, we then sort of overlaid that on the buildings and tried to work out which buildings were damaged from that.
So in the sense that the damage is determined by the delta, the changes between two states. It's not something that is directly measurable, but it can be assumed when you've got a before and after to create that sense of calculation. Now, one of the things that you speak about later on is the possibility of doing something where you would show how these damages have occurred over time. So did you have potentially access to multiple different phases of this sort of satellite measurements to enable you to do, I don't know, week 1, week 2, week 3 kind of sequencing?
Yes, so we essentially had data every week, which I believe that's just how often the satellite went over that particular spot, I think. So yeah, we had it sort of starting on, I think the first one was like the 28th of February, which is around when the siege began, and then we had it like for I think 4 weeks after that. So yeah, our last one was on the 17th of April, which is sort of not that long before when we published it.
I see.
So yeah, I originally thought that, oh, we've got this, like, this is fantastic, we've got data through time, we can like show the progression of the siege through the city. But then I quite quickly realized that firstly there wasn't like that much of a pattern. It just seemed like they'd sort of been targeting like all different bits of the city like sort of throughout, and it just sort of steadily gets worse. And also I realized it was just going to be too complicated to do a sort of like a color scheme showing different like time periods of damage, and then also comparing that to undamaged. It just like, because the buildings are so small that you really need like bright color to contrast with that. Otherwise,
rather than some sort of graduated color scheme, which wouldn't be sort of visibly detectable to the eye. Now, one of the things about, again, tell me if it's not something you're able to answer, but I was curious about one of the things mentioned in the article that comes with the piece in the digital version, which talks about the sort of method that you used to sort of check the accuracy of the method you were arriving at versus, I suspect, more of a manual judgment that was conducted by the UN. And it seemed like the percentage accuracy was really good, both for the damaged buildings and for the undamaged buildings. But at what point could that have been so different that the whole process would have been abandoned because it wouldn't have been reliable enough? And I guess the point I'm perhaps speaking to is, we often have data that's uncertain, but it doesn't mean that we can't progress, because it may be that it's good enough. And was there a point in time when there was just a pragmatic judgment of, this is sufficient, this is good enough, we'll tell people it won't be perfect, but it's good enough to proceed with?
I mean, I don't know exactly what that cutoff point would be. I mean, I guess if it had been less accurate, we would have tried to refine the model a bit and try and get better accuracy. Yeah, as I mentioned before, we did try and map bombings across the Ukraine using satellite data, and just we weren't sure that it was solid enough. So yeah, obviously we're not going to publish something if we don't think it's accurate enough.
The other classification task, as shown in one of the bar charts, which breaks down the type of buildings that have been damaged, how did you know that a building was, you know, a kind of commercial or industrial or a transport building or a residential? What sort of methodology was used for that?
So that I believe comes from OpenStreetMap's classifications of buildings. So we are relying a bit on them to have accurately classified it. And actually, in fact, we originally had another category on there for military buildings, but it was such a small number of buildings, and upon further investigation, we realized that the like 3 buildings or however many it was that like were classified as military weren't probably not actually being used as military buildings anymore. They're essentially just warehouses. So we ended up getting rid of that category because we just like weren't sure that it was really accurate.
That's a good point, because I guess it could be shifting in its purpose as a building from before war and within the war. And I suppose the other question that I would have is, a lot of the story about any war is the damage to things like infrastructure, like bridges and train networks. And I noticed that in Mariupol there was a zoo park, and I'm just wondering to what extent, therefore, this could have ever gone beyond just building damage to also include just kind of infrastructural damage.
Yeah. So originally I was thinking of just showing a heat map just of the SAR image, which basically does just show like physically where in the city is damaged. So I guess that would have, like, if there was damage to a zoo park, that probably would have been a bit easier to know. Although actually, because we're sort of looking at like where the buildings have collapsed, maybe that would have been a bit more difficult because they wouldn't necessarily have been rubble.
Open spaces,
might not have changed height so much. But anyway, yeah, we ended up deciding to sort of show more detail of showing which buildings we actually think have been damaged, partly because yeah, it's always nice to have more detail, and also because a large part of like the sort of analysis was focusing on like number of buildings, proportion of buildings, so it sort of made sense to show that rather than just a sort of like rougher heat map of where the damage was.
Right. And I suppose an extension of that question then is, as you look back now on the project, do you feel any sense of, I wish we could have had this data, or I wish we could have done this with that data, or I had more time to do some things? Is there anything that you kind of look back on with any remote sense of unfinished business, or kind of, I wish we'd not had that limitation?
I think so. I think for the online version, so it was actually a collaboration with my colleague Evan, who created the slider and sourced all these photos. I think if we had a bit more time, it might have been really nice to have make this map interactive in the online version, just so you could and because it is very detailed. Yeah, it's a bit harder to, especially on the mobile version. It might have been nice to zoom in, but that would have been, yeah, quite a lot of extra work, and yeah, we were working to a tight deadline, so that didn't happen. But yeah, that would have been nice, I think.
The other question I've just got about the data that we see regards to the choices that we make, certainly in maps, about the framing. And I know that you discussed about the trade-off between, you want to show Mariupol as the city, but Mariupol is not just a rectangle, but you have to pick a rectangle. And where that point is a judgment to make, but you also want to have enough detail to do justice to it. So how did you sort of reconcile where to stop this kind of boundary, this almost artificial boundary of the map that we see?
Yeah, so I that was a lot of sort of trial and error, and I think I was actually looking back on a few of my drafts in preparation for this, and I noticed that every draft I've just like zoomed slightly further in. So I just slowly zoomed more and more in, because initially I sort of obviously like wanted to show the whole city, but it sort of got like a big suburb to the north, a big suburb to the east, and a big suburb to the south. And I was initially skeptical actually that these showing building level data was even going to work in print. I thought it might turn into kind of a fuzzy mess, because, you know, if it's too detailed, it just doesn't show it well. But yeah, after trying a sort of closer in crop of the city, I realized that like it would probably work with a smaller crop. And yeah, so it was basically just a case of balancing how much do you show that you've got an overview of like different districts, like industrial and residential, but where you can still pick out individual buildings, particularly because we wanted to add some labels. So for example, to the theatre, which was like famously bombed, and also the maternity hospital.
On that note of, so the two things there. The first is the buildings themselves as objects on a map. Is that something that you had to kind of hand draw, or is it something that's, you mentioned OpenStreetMap, is it something that's already available as a layer, but then you have to manually choose the ones that you're going to identify as being damaged and then switch off the others? How does that sort of object identification work?
Yes, so the building like shape file comes from OpenStreetMap, so like, thankfully we didn't have to like draw out every
right, okay.
that wouldn't have happened, but yeah, we did have to identify which ones we were going to like fill in as damaged. And so I believe my colleague like essentially just, she created like a second shape file which I layered on top, which basically just has the damaged building. So if I were to hide the red layer here, you'd see like all the same buildings just in grey below.
I see. And would you have ever at any point try to almost give the same treatment to the undamaged buildings as you did to the damaged buildings, i.e. Selecting them, filling them in, or would you always have just left them as a kind of a background artifact in the map?
So I did initially try giving the buildings a different color to the roads, and in fact I also tried just hiding the roads because I thought it made it a bit easier to sort of eyeball the different proportions of damaged to undamaged. But then the problem with that was that if you took off the roads, it just became very, well, first it didn't really look as much like a city,
Right.
and also it became a bit hard to sort of like judge what different areas were like. So for example, the industrial areas just looked like really empty without any road.
Yeah.
But then I found that if I tried to color the damaged buildings in differently to the roads, it just got like too busy. So yeah, I tried to use like another neutral tone because obviously I wanted to use a neutral tone for undamaged because it's really the damaged buildings that we're interested in. But then like having two different neutral shades just looked a bit messy. So in the end, I mean, I think perhaps the roads might be a very slightly lighter, but they're basically almost the same shade.
Yeah. Now you spoke there about the judgments you had to make to ensure it was still visible in print, especially. And I guess that involves not just how does it look on screen, how does it look on your local printer, but you have to also, do you have to do like a dry run proper print resolution? I mean, how does it work to double check that not only will the details be captured, but even things like the CMYK overlap of print isn't a little bit off? I mean, how do you test that before you go to print?
I mean, yeah, it's not.
Or is it a leap of faith?
I don't know if there's really a way of testing registration, because that could just sort of randomly like not be so good on one particular print run if there's a mistake of the printers or something.
Yeah.
But in terms of like testing the colors, so I guess also one reason that we have chart colors is that we sort of know that these colors will look okay once they're printed, and it's also just a matter of like I'm quite used to how things will print. So I know, for example, that the grays often print a little bit lighter than you're expecting. So I made the gray in the print PDF version a little bit darker than I actually wanted, just so I knew that it would show up in print.
It's true that I found that a lot. Print doesn't always look the same gray doesn't always look the same as intended on print, and it can be such a crucial thing because you want a subtle shade for many reasons, but if it's invisible, it's useless.
Exactly. I've had maps before where sort of I've used a subtle shade for like no data, and like it like looks probably invisible. A little bit too light once it's printed. So it's just a matter of, and also I can go back and look at past examples of pages, and I have like loads of copies of The Economist at home, so I can be like, oh, I want to do something similar to that issue. Right. How did that look when it was printed? So I'll actually go back and look. But yeah, and also I do sometimes just print it out, but like in the office like it looks very different to like printer. Like often the red shades look really purple. So yeah, I've got to take that one with a pinch of salt.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing I was interested in about with regards to the coloured usage on the map is that you coloured the water, the sea, and also the kind of rivers. Did you feel that was an important feature to bring out? Because obviously the blue could have been used elsewhere to highlight something, but did you feel that land, non-land separation was an important thing to draw out?
Yeah, so that was a slightly unusual case because I didn't particularly feel that it was, but it was basically a factor of deciding that in order to get the maximum contrast between the buildings and the roads and like the plain areas, I decided to make the background of the map white, whereas normally we'd make it a sort of land color, or some other neutral shade. But then once that was white, I really needed to like give the water like a strong enough color to contrast with that white, just so you can understand what you're looking at. So yeah, like if
orientation reasons,
exactly. Like although the water's not important, it does immediately tell you that you're looking at the coast. So that's actually quite important.
Yeah, I think what's interesting as well is that it's a colour choice is never in isolation. Your commitment to that colour then has a consequence on that, and then has a consequence on that, not just on the hue, but also on the different lights and brightness levels. And it's I don't think it's always appreciated the amount of iterations I'm sure you've gone through until you found that moment of right. leave that there. We've got the right balance, and everyone can come along and say, why don't you make the land green? But if we do that, it has this kind of counter effect. So it is an iterative process.
Yeah, it's very difficult of like, it's like, oh, this one doesn't work, but then if I change that, it has like knock-on consequences for this. So you often find that it's sort of like a puzzle where you've got to find something that works all together, which can be quite difficult sometimes.
Yeah.
Especially also when you're doing different types of charts. So for example, like for area charts, like a really strong, like if I'd had a really big area chart, like it might have looked a bit horrible to have just a huge block of red. Like as it is, this is quite a small area chart, so it doesn't look too bad. But yeah, like often colors that work for certain charts, like bar and area charts, I tend to do slightly more subtle ones. But then that doesn't work for a line chart, which like you need a strong color for the line. Otherwise you can't really see it.
Yeah, and that is one of the benefits of the area chart, is that you've got that fill effect to make it a very clear kind of contour that you're looking at. Just going back to the map again, so I understand from speaking to my cartographer colleagues that this is typically called a unique values map in the mapping tools, where you've got these objects, the buildings, the sort of shapes, and then you give them some visual treatment, either categorically in this case, or you mentioned the potential for that sort of ordinal sequencing before. But you also talked earlier about the idea of just a heat map of damage, but you also position that as the kind of fallback, the perhaps implied less preferred option. Was it kind of clear to you early on that you were going to persevere with this sort of building by building resolution approach and not any other compromise mapping technique, or a choropleth, or an isometric, or a isorhythmic map, I think it's called sometimes? What was that? Were you kind of determined from the outset, I'm going to get this done, I'm going to get this sort of idea executed?
I mean, I initially thought that this approach wasn't going to work, so I actually, like, my heat map was my plan A.
Right, okay.
I think it's probably a more common type of map, and yeah, it works like okay in print, whereas this we don't often do maps this detailed, so this was kind of my plan B. But yeah, I think just partly because we were talking about number of buildings a lot, it did make sense to just color in the buildings rather than some other more, like, I don't know, other type of technique.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it needs that treatment to do justice to the curiosity it's serving about where's the damage and what extent of damage has occurred. So yeah, as you mentioned, we've got the map is the centerpiece, certainly for the printed version, and we've got this accompanying bar chart to summarize the nature or the type or function of the buildings that have been damaged. And then there's an interesting sort of both the percentage of the buildings that have been damaged of that nature and the extent in their sort of physical footprint. And that does reveal some interesting patterns about the maybe low percentage but huge area of damage. I mean, at any point did you think about any other chart types other than the bar chart and stat bar chart to show that? I'm thinking like a Mariupol chart could have worked, a scatter plot with the two variables. Did you explore any other methods, or, I mean, it seems fairly kind of reasonable to use the ones that you did?
I mean, I didn't really explore types that weren't bar charts, but I did originally try to put both of these charts into just one single stacked bar chart, where I basically had, like, it was just of like area damage with then stacked with area undamaged.
Right.
But the trouble with that was that like there were like industrial and residential were just so much bigger than every other category, as you can kind of see from the right hand side, that you just couldn't see the breakdown for any of the other categories. Whereas, like, obviously it's actually quite interesting that half of medical buildings have been damaged. That's quite shocking. But if you just see that in terms of area, it just like didn't look like that much at all. So yeah, I decided to split it out into sort of two bar charts.
That makes sense.
Because for different categories, like different sides of this are interesting.
And you mentioned that on the digital version, we've then got the satellite slider. So we've got the before and after view of the kind of damage, but more so the satellite readings that you mentioned, this SAR sort of measurement. And that's a really nice feature. And I guess, I mean, this is digital only, would you have desired to have something akin to that display, maybe a side-by-side view in the print, or were you always just mindful that the print would just be the map and then some of the summary charts and all these other things would have to only be in the digital version?
So we did originally try to have a small map in the print version, basically showing how much our model lined up with the UN test data. So it sort of showed like buildings that were perceived as damaged by both of us, buildings that were perceived as damaged by the UN, and buildings that were perceived damaged by just us. So it just sort of showed how much they lined up, which might have been nice to include, but in the end I sort of felt like it was a little bit too into the weeds, and it was better just to have like the really simple area chart below. Even though it's like a very basic chart, it's just nice to have that time element in there somewhere.
Yeah.
So and yeah, perhaps if we'd like occasionally we make the section 2 pages, maybe if it'd been a 2-pager we would have included that. But yeah, in terms of the satellite imagery though, I do often think that satellite imagery doesn't print particularly well. I mean, you can play around with the balance, I guess, to try and sort of brighten it up a bit, but we did have some satellite imagery in like our briefing about the Ukraine a few weeks before that, and I did think it was a little bit hard to like pick out detail. So I thought if you're talking about buildings sort of being reduced to rubble, it might actually be quite difficult to see. So
yeah,
I was a bit skeptical about how it would work in print, basically.
Yeah, that would make sense. And as you said, then we've got the area chart in the digital version, this sort of story over time of the damage, sort of progress. And then in the digital version, we've got another map which zooms in on, and I've tried to practice this pronunciation, and apologies to the people who live in this region, Zhovtnevy region. So again, was this something that you felt was worthy of an extra degree of sort of zooming in on a region? Because what you've got with this then is some pinpointed locations that have a companion photograph. So what was the sort of thinking about then sort of this sort of zoomed in section?
Yeah, I mean, we just thought that if we had some photos actually showing like some of this damage, it sort of like made the map a little bit more meaningful. Just obviously you can think, oh, it's damaged, but like, you know, it can be a bit hard to bring to mind exactly what that looks like. And then looking at these images, it's like, oh yeah, that's like, yeah, it's pretty shocking. Although looking at this again, I feel like it might have worked better as a small mini map next to each image rather than just having them all vertically stacked like they are. I mean, it works okay, but yeah, you always look at things you could have done slightly differently.
You could almost preserve that sense of the map with the photograph in the same simultaneous view. Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah.
That might have worked. That might have worked better in retrospect.
maybe if you had a 6th day, you would have had a chance to think about that. So we've talked about the different kind of visual contents, and you've talked already about the potential desire, if you had more time and scope, to do a bit more interactivity potentially. But some of the other sort of decisions that you have to make with regards to things like annotations and the written content. So the title intrigues me because, first of all, I love the house style of the digital titles, which is header, subheader, and both those devices say something like a conclusion or a finding that the visuals support below. But there's actually a different title for the print. Why is that, and who does the titling? How do you arrive at what this thing will be? And last part to this question is, do you do that early or do you do that afterwards when you know what content is in?
So often the title that goes above the chart, we often write that sort of more towards the end once we know exactly what the images are going to look like. With regards to these titles, they're mainly written by the editor. So yeah, the print one, the digital one is generally a bit different, partly because like in terms of SEO, I think there are certain considerations in terms of what you include. So I think, yeah, if you talk about like ruined buildings, that probably gives a better description of what's within it. We also like lose that title above the chart in the web version, partly because if you keep it in there, so often for graphic detail, we have a sort of big data viz at the top. And actually, I think that, to be honest, there was perhaps an argument. We sort of looked back on this afterwards and we were like, oh, maybe we should have put the map at the top rather than the satellite image. But I do think it works either way around. But if you have that data viz at the top, then you just sort of have too many titles before you get to content.
Right.
So say I'd left in that, what was it in the print version? It was every neighborhood in Mariupol has suffered damage grave enough to be detected by satellites. So if I'd then put that in under the two,
it's the third tier,
it's just a third tier. It's a bit repetitive, so yeah, we often just lose that further.
That makes sense.
Version.
And the other thing that's immediately striking in the digital version is this kind of hero image, this kind of first viewpoint, which is really quite a powerful composition photograph-wise. You've got a pair of buildings on the left and right, or maybe the building that's got this sort of decimated middle, but then you've got this sort of view into the distance as well. So you mentioned that you may not have been the person to pick the photographs, but what's the sort of decision making that takes place with regards to picking photographs? Because I guess you've got the luxury of access to a large library of options. I know there's photographs in this from Reuters and AFP and Shutterstock, so that the variety of options is there. But how do you choose? You know, what's the kind of rationale for why is that going to go there?
So we actually have like a whole picture desk whose like job is to find pictures.
I
so
see.
Yeah, normally I wouldn't really be particularly. This is actually a rare instance where the data team was involved in getting these satellite images. So yeah, I'm sure they have a whole load of guidelines of like what you can and can't do and what like you should do with these images. But yeah. With this image in particular, actually, we did want to locate this one, show where it was on the map, but it turned out to be impossible. We just couldn't work out where in the city it was.
Right.
Unlike with the three ones below, which I think were, I mean, except for the theatre, which is like relatively obvious, some of the others it was still quite difficult to actually work out where exactly they were taken from. But
there's also something about the colour tones that those photos bring, which is a nice balance. It doesn't kind of clash with the house style of all the other assets, and it feels very cohesive as a single piece. Therefore, some other quick questions just about annotation. The written content. Did you do that? Did somebody else do that? And again, how does that sort of dovetail in terms of when you, as the visual journalist, when do you know that you've got some space or a need for a graphic element? How does that sort of work as a process?
Yeah, so there is actually quite a bit of back and forth on that. In terms of like the copy on the charts, often I will just write something in initially. And all of the visual data journalists at The Economist, we sort of know what our style is for chart titles. We know sort of what we're meant to include. So I think it's quite helpful if I just put something in initially, and then sometimes there'll be quite a bit of like back and forth with the editor about like style, and sort of like they might want to change something. And also it sort of helps, like if you've showed it to other people, sometimes they'll notice that like the way you've worded it is slightly confusing. So for example, I think with the bottom area chart, I thought it was obvious that it was cumulative. But we ended up adding total afterwards, because I think I initially just had built up area damaged in Mariupol, but then we added total built up area damaged in Mariupol to make it like extra clear. So yeah, I will often write them, and then just there's a lot of back and forth. Often it's a bit of a balance. So I often want the labels to be really short, just because I think it can start to look a bit ugly if you have three-line labels, and the editor often wants to sort of like pack in as much information as they can. So it's often a little bit of a war.
And then I guess the last part of the design anatomy to think about and to chat about is just this kind of trade-off between print and digital. And one of the things that you mentioned earlier, you mentioned this term sort of page furniture, and the sort of challenges of having to accommodate. Can you just elaborate a little bit further on what you mean by that? Because it's it's just another obstacle to overcome, certainly in the print version.
Yeah, so in the print version, there are quite a few hidden rules that we sort of have to abide by when we're designing this graphic detail page. So yeah, I came from a web background, so this is all stuff I had to learn since joining. But sort of the most important thing is that we try to line things up with the text columns below. So for example, this bar chart at the top is the same width as the text column below, and that just sort of helps the page to look a bit more cohesive and
balanced,
neater. And yeah, exactly. And also we try to make sure that the colors on the page don't clash with, so at the top of the page, for example, we've got some red text and a sort of big like red rectangle. And another week I tried to use a sort of slightly paler red in a graphic, and the art director thought it clashed with this other type of red, which like retrospectively he was right. So yeah, often there's like so yeah, every page we send to the head of graphics and the art director, and he'll often like pick up on things like this. So but yeah, as I've designed more of these pages, I think I sort of recognize more of these issues in advance. So
yeah, absolutely. And the last thing then is about what you mentioned earlier, the sort of responsiveness. So for the digital version, how it looks on mobile, a bit different to how it looks on the desktop. And I guess, is it fair to say that in this case it's probably desktop first, but then the mobile has the slight compromise, smaller, less detailed version?
Yeah, so sometimes we do sort of do just like a completely different treatment on the mobile if we just think it's not going to work at all. It is like, because so many people read it on a mobile, it is worth that investment. In this case, for the mobile version, I sort of just pared it down a lot. So I just had damaged buildings. Retrospectively, maybe I could have actually got rid of the roads on a mobile. I know I didn't, probably just because of time constraints, but that actually might have been a good idea, just to simplify it as much as possible. And then I popped the bar chart below, so yeah, it's not covering any of the map.
But again, in your thought process, I guess you're having to think about this sort of transition from a desktop laptop size thing to a tablet, to then the different phones. And again, we'll share a screen that shows you this sort of sequencing of almost the kind of transition to each. But it's just another bundle of work that you've got to sort of produce, another kind of bunch of assets to make for these kind of things.
Yeah, it takes quite a lot longer than you think was going to take, just because like to do it well, you're basically designing like 5, or even I might have done more than 5 in this case, just because I wanted there to be one really big version of the map on desktop, just so that you get like the best possible experience, because it's so detailed. So yeah, that does take quite a long time.
And as we just wrap up the sort of process, can you sort of summarize the tools that you did use for this? I mean, you've already touched on a few, QGIS, AI to HTML. We'll link those in the episode post that comes with this. But yeah, what's the sort of repertoire of tools that you fundamentally use for this then?
So for mapping, we use QGIS, which is open source software, so it's free to download. And yeah, it's mostly good. Sometimes, like as a beginner, it's a little bit hard to understand, but yeah. And then after we've oh yeah, and actually sometimes there's like a prior step where in order to get the data in the format we want, we might rearrange it in R, or sort of do a bit of data cleaning. In this case, my colleague did most of that, so I didn't actually do that step. And then once we bring it out of QGIS, we export it as an SVG, and then bring that into Illustrator, where we can then edit the colors, like yeah, sort of basically optimize the design, and then also sort of create the rest of the layout with that. And for the charts, I think I just used ggplot. Although we also have an in-house chart tool that most of the visual journalists use for just like bog standard charts.
And you mentioned in one of your tweets when you launched this that you kind of the computer processing time and power required for some of this. Was that at the QGIS part of this process?
No, the QGIS file was actually fine, I guess, just because QGIS is designed to deal with shape files. But actually, like once it was converted to an SVG, it then became like an absolutely like massive file. And then because every single little building is like is sort of rendered in actually reasonably high detail. So once you bring that file into Illustrator, it just like was working at the pace of a snail. Or in fact, I even tried to reopen my very first draft of this, and yeah, just my illustration just crashed. So I found that if I zoomed in a little bit, then I didn't have to export all of the suburbs, and that helped a lot. I also did a bit of editing of the map just to sort of remove features off the edge that I didn't need before, which simplified it slightly. And then I also found that like while I was creating sort of editing the bar chart, I'd just turn off the map because that was also causing Illustrator to slow down a lot. So yeah, I had to find a few strategies.
Well, I think what you know, summarising a few things now, I think what you've really kind of brought out, Ros, is the amount of trade-offs that we don't see take place often in these pieces, and the amount of things that you're having to sort of almost like sort of 4D chess, think in advance of the consequence of that choice. What will it have? Even if it's down to just the functional performance of a tool making it, if it's not viable, then you have to abandon that routine. So it's been fascinating. Now, just from your own sort of reflections now, looking back, I mean, you've talked about a few things that you might have done differently or with more time had the benefit of luxury of doing more things. But how do you kind of look back on this piece now, and what kind of feedback have you had? What kind of response did you get from people sort of looking at this?
Yeah, I think it was quite a successful project. I think it's rare that I just get compliments from the graphics director and the art director, and they both said nice things, which is nice. Yeah, I think it's nice to have like a really nice visual to work with. So I think I was just lucky in terms of having this data. Like we sort of had this big map to work around. It's much easier to create a nice looking page if you've just got like this really nice detailed data to start with. But yeah, I think I'm quite pleased with how the sort of limited color palette works, because I sort of tried to, because the map was so detailed, I tried to balance it quite a lot in terms of making the other elements really simple. Just if you've already got loads going on in the map, it just can look a bit like cluttered and crazy. If like say I tried to use loads of different colors on the map, it just would look like a huge mess. So yeah, I'm generally quite pleased with it. But yeah, like who knows, if we'd had a few extra days, maybe it could have,
of course,
made it even
everyone
better.
always wants a bit more time, I guess. But no, again, I knew it was a great piece before we chatted, but I really even appreciate even more the amount of thought and care that's gone into this. So thank you, Ros, for a really insightful discussion about this piece. And thank you to everyone out there for watching and listening to this episode, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks very much.
To see more information about today's episode, including some links to key sites and resources mentioned, please visit my website at visualizingdata.com. Here you'll also be able to find details about my book, information about my public and private training courses, as well as over a decade of blog posts. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking, subscribing and spreading the word. See you next time.